Every day, Chris Johnson wakes up knowing ALS isn't giving him a break. The former NFL star has opened up about what his daily battle really looks like, and some of the challenges he faces are far more difficult than most people realize. Let me break it down. On a Monday morning, sitting in his own home, Chris Johnson looked into a camera and told the country he has ALS. He wasn't standing at a podium. He wasn't wearing a jersey. He was in a chair next to his wife, using a device that spoke for him in a voice built from recordings of his own. Michael Strahan sat across from him for Good Morning America, and what came out wasn't a press release. It was a man explaining piece by piece how fast his body had turned on him. Johnson said it has continued to progress much faster than he ever imagined, and that he wants people to understand just how quickly ALS can attack the body. Then he gave the detail that landed hardest. Just over a year before, he'd been picking up his 7-year-old daughter so she could make a wish with her birthday cake. By the time of the interview, he couldn't do that anymore. That's the whole story in 2 sentences. A father who could once outrun entire defenses can't lift his own kid. The diagnosis itself came in 2025 when Johnson was 39. He told Strahan he was diagnosed with the disease that year and that there's no history of ALS in his family. Doctors gave him an explanation, but not a reassuring one. His doctors believe his case is what's called sporadic ALS, which is actually how the vast majority of ALS cases happen. And that's one of the reasons the disease can be so shocking. It can happen to someone who never expected it. Johnson wasn't the only one blindsided. His wife, Brittany, had watched him struggle with his grip for weeks before any of this had a name. She said she thought it had to be something related to football, maybe a pinched nerve, but never ALS. That's the trap. A guy who spent a decade absorbing hits for a living develops a weak hand. And the first instinct for him, for his wife, for anyone who knew his history, is to blame the game, not a terminal disease. The reactions came fast once the news broke. The Titans put out a statement calling him a person who leaves a mark on an organization that you just can't put into words, with Johnson's impact on the Nashville community and the locker room written permanently into the franchise's story. The team said learning the news was difficult and pledged to stand by him through it. The Cardinals, one of his former teams, echoed the same sentiment publicly. They posted that they were sending strength, love, and support to Johnson. The Jets and the NFL Players Association put out their own messages too. But the reaction that actually meant something to Johnson came from someone who already knew exactly what this disease does. Tim Shaw, his old Titans teammate, was diagnosed with ALS more than a decade earlier and is still fighting it. Shaw didn't send a generic statement. He texted a reporter directly, saying Johnson had actually put hope back into him after 12 years in the fight, and that watching his old teammates' attitude had knocked him out of what he called survival mode. Shaw said he'd been talking with Johnson for a while, and that he's proud of the attitude the running back is carrying into this. In fact, it's something that's inspired him. Then there's Ryan Fitzpatrick, the quarterback who handed Johnson the ball for years in Tennessee. Fitzpatrick didn't hide behind a careful statement either. He talked about the ache of watching someone whose whole identity was built on physical dominance get taken apart from the inside. He said ALS is such a tough thing to deal with for Chris and everyone around him. You can just imagine the frustration of a mind that's still there while the body starts to fail. He and his family sent their support directly to Chris, Brittany, and their kids. 3 different corners of Johnson's football life: his franchise, his former teammate battling the same disease, and the quarterback who threw him touchdown passes, all reacting to the same gut punch of news within days of each other. That's the scale of what this diagnosis has done. It didn't just touch one locker room. It rippled through every team he ever wore a jersey for. And Johnson knew exactly what he was walking into by going public. He wasn't doing it for sympathy. He said that if sharing his story helps even one person get diagnosed sooner, inspires more research, or gives another family hope, it is worth it. That's the mission he set for himself the moment he decided to sit down in front of a camera and let the world watch him fight. To understand why this diagnosis hit so hard, you have to understand who Chris Johnson was before any of this. He wasn't a role player. He was, for one season, maybe the single most electrifying athlete in the entire NFL. Johnson came out of East Carolina, and the Titans took him in the first round of the 2008 draft. He didn't need long to prove it was the right call. He had rare speed and routinely ran away from defenders, and that blazing prowess led him to a 2,006-yard season in just his second year, earning him the nickname CJ2K. That season alone put him in company with only a handful of players in NFL history. In 2009, Johnson became the 6th of just 9 players ever to rush for over 2,000 yards in a single season, and he broke Marshall Faulk's single-season record for scrimmage yards with 2,509. That scrimmage yard mark hasn't been touched since. He totaled 2,509 yards from scrimmage that year, a number that still stands as an NFL record. That kind of production doesn't happen by accident. It happens because a guy is faster and more explosive than anyone lined up across from him. People who covered the Titans during those years remember 2 80-yard touchdown runs in a single game. Runs where defenders simply couldn't get an angle on him. That's not hyperbole about a good player. That's what made him a nightmare matchup for an entire decade of NFL defenses. The overall numbers back up the peak. For his career, the back totaled 9,651 rushing yards and 55 rushing touchdowns, while adding 2,255 yards receiving and 9 receiving touchdowns on 307 catches. He made 3 Pro Bowls, earned first-team All-Pro honors, and took home Offensive Player of the Year in that record-setting season. He played 6 years in Tennessee, 1 with the Jets, 3 more with the Cardinals, and walked away from the game in 2017. None of that career explains what's happening to his body now. There's no history of head trauma diagnosis tying directly to his case. No family history. Nothing that gave him or his doctors a warning sign to look for. What he had instead was a normal life that suddenly wasn't. Johnson said he was feeling good the year before his diagnosis, working out daily and spending time with his wife and 4 children. Then his grip started to feel wrong. That's often how ALS announces itself, quietly, in a hand, in a word slightly slurred, in something so small that a family assumes it's nothing. Brittany assumed it was football catching up with him, years after the fact. That assumption is common enough that doctors and researchers have actually studied it directly, because for a guy like Johnson, that assumption isn't unreasonable. It's backed by real data. Research out of Boston University's CTE Center found something that hits differently once you know Johnson's story. According to that research released in 2021, pro football players are 4 times more likely to develop and die from ALS than the adult male population. Though at the time, researchers couldn't determine why the rate was higher and suggested repetitive head impacts and traumatic brain injuries might play a role. A separate, larger study backs up similar numbers. A 2021 study in JAMA Network Open examined over 19,000 NFL players across nearly 6 decades and found the rate of ALS diagnosis was 3.6 times higher among NFL players than matched men in the general population, with the risk of death from ALS nearly 4 times higher. And notably, players who developed ALS averaged 7 seasons in the league, compared to 4.5 seasons for players without it. Johnson played 10 seasons, long enough under that research to sit in the higher risk range. He's acknowledged that connection himself, referencing the studies on his own Instagram, even while admitting nobody can say for certain what caused his particular case. Doctors are careful here too. The honest scientific position is that a link is suspected, not proven. Repetitive head impacts are suspected to contribute via a shared pathology with CTE, but causality remains unproven, and the disease-modifying treatment options remain limited to modestly effective drugs. What isn't in question is how rare it is for someone this young to get this diagnosis. His diagnosis comes at an age well below the typical onset of ALS, which most commonly affects people between 55 and 75 years old. Johnson was 39. A man who spent his career as the fastest thing on the field is now, statistically, an outlier even within a disease defined by cruelty. This is the part of the story that made the interview so hard to watch. Not the diagnosis itself, but the day-to-day reality Johnson laid out in plain terms. It started with his hand. In the interview, Johnson said he first noticed weakness in his right hand last year, when his grip didn't feel right and his condition began to worsen from there, until doctors ultimately gave him the diagnosis. That's it. That's how it begins for a lot of ALS patients. Not a collapse, not an emergency room visit, just a grip that feels a little off one morning and never goes back to normal. From there, the disease moved through him at a pace his own doctors didn't predict. He said outright that the speed of it has outpaced everything he expected going in. By the time of the interview, small physical tasks that used to be automatic were gone. Now, he can't hold a cup or speak on his own. Speaking on his own. Think about what that actually means for a guy who spent a career doing interviews, cutting promos with reporters, talking trash on the field. Now his voice comes through a machine, and it's not even a generic computer voice. It's built from his own recordings. Chris and Brittany gave the interview in their own home, with Chris communicating via a speech-generating machine operated with his eyes, using an AI version of his own voice recorded shortly after his diagnosis. That detail alone is one of the most jarring parts of this entire story. Someone had the foresight, right after the diagnosis landed, to sit Johnson down and record his voice, because they knew that voice wouldn't last. They banked it, so that when the day came that his mouth couldn't form the words anymore, his eyes could still move a cursor and his own recorded voice could still say them for him. That's not a hypothetical anymore. That's where he's at right now, today, in every conversation with his kids, every appearance, every moment with Brittany. The physical toll runs alongside all of this. ALS doesn't just take away speech, it takes away everything, piece by piece. It's a progressive disease in which the brain loses connection with the muscles, and those affected slowly lose their ability to walk, talk, eat, dress, write, swallow, and eventually breathe. Every item on that list is a thing Johnson used to do without thinking about it. Now each one is a battle, and the doctors have told him plainly that they don't reverse. He said it himself, describing exactly what it felt like to sit in that doctor's office and get the full picture. He said they hoped it was something else, but after thorough testing, the doctors finally came down with a diagnosis of ALS, told them about a medication that might extend his life by a few months, and then told him and Brittany to get their affairs in order. And it was hard hearing that. Get your affairs in order. That's the sentence that turns an athlete's comeback story into something entirely different. There's no fourth quarter to fight back in here. There's a clock, and doctors telling you roughly how much of it is left. And yet the daily reality Johnson describes isn't just decline. It's a fight he chose deliberately every single morning. He's been blunt about the two options that sat in front of him. The moment the diagnosis became real, he said honestly he doesn't know if you ever fully process it. At first you're in shock, then you realize you have two choices. You can give up or you can fight. And he chose to fight. That choice plays out in small, specific ways every day. It's in the medication schedule. It's in physical therapy sessions that used to be about building muscle and are now about preserving whatever function is left. It's in a clinical trial he's actively part of, something most patients never get access to. Johnson is taking part in a clinical trial as part of his treatment. That trial connects back to a specific doctor, Merrick Kudkowicz, a Harvard neurologist who also treated actor Eric Dane before his death from ALS earlier this year. Johnson reached out to her directly after watching her speak publicly about the disease, and she's since spoken about his case herself, saying his participation in that trial, alongside standard medication, appears to have had a real effect on slowing things down. None of it removes the disease, but it's the difference between doing nothing and doing everything available, every single day, with no promise it will work. No one fights ALS alone. And Johnson has been clear that the people around him are the entire reason he keeps showing up for each hard day. Brittany Johnson is at the center of that. She went from being his wife to being, functionally, his full-time caregiver, someone managing medication, appointments, communication, and the physical needs that come with a disease that takes away independence piece by piece. Brittany has taken on the role of primary caregiver for her husband. Johnson has said as much himself, crediting her directly for staying through every stage of this. He said of Brittany, "She hasn't left my side through any of this. She was in that GMA chair next to him, not just as support, but as someone with her own account of watching this unfold. From the outside before it had a name. She's the one who watched the grip weakness show up first and reached for the explanation that made sense given his history. Years of physical punishment on a football field. It wasn't until testing ruled everything else out that ALS became the answer neither of them wanted. Then there are the kids. Johnson and Brittany have 4 children, including twin sons, and he's been direct about what they mean to his will to keep fighting. He said his kids are a huge part of why he keeps going, and that every day he wakes up wanting more time with them, to make more memories, and just be their dad. Those twin sons are already showing the athletic gifts that made their father famous, competing in camps at a middle school age. Johnson gets to watch that from the sidelines now, in a body that can't join them the way it once could. Outside his own house, the person who understands his fight better than anyone in football is Tim Shaw. Shaw isn't a distant former teammate offering a generic tribute. He's a man who has lived what Johnson is living. For over a decade longer, Tim Shaw, a former linebacker and special teams captain, who was teammates with Johnson from 2010 to 2012, received his ALS diagnosis in 2014. That means Shaw has been fighting this disease for roughly 12 years by the time Johnson's diagnosis became public, a stretch of time that puts him well past the typical survival window doctors describe for ALS patients. What makes their connection remarkable is that it isn't one-directional. You'd expect the veteran of the disease to be the one offering comfort, and he has. But Shaw has said Johnson's attitude going into this fight has done something for him too. After over a decade of settling into routines just to survive, Shaw texted a reporter saying he had to brag on Johnson, that his old teammate had actually injected some hope in him. After 12 years in this fight, since you get into your own routines and beliefs, and Johnson's attitude and excitement about treatments had shaken him out of survival mode, leading him to try a couple of new treatments himself recently. That's two men who once shared a locker room, now sharing something far heavier, pushing each other forward. The Titans have publicly acknowledged that bond too, posting tributes to Shaw around the same period Johnson's story broke, tying the two men's fights together in the eyes of the fan base that watched them both play. Then there's Ryan Fitzpatrick, who represents a different kind of relationship. Not someone fighting the disease, but someone forced to reckon with. What it means that a teammate he trusted with the ball is now fighting for his life. Fitzpatrick talked about a signed football Johnson gave him years earlier, a small inside joke between two guys who spent seasons in the same huddle. Now that memory sits next to a much heavier one. Fitzpatrick said that personally, he'd do it all over again when it comes to football, even as the risks are more prevalent now than ever. Though what comes with age is a more grim reality. He's 43 now himself, old enough to be watching friends face things he never expected at this stage of life. Beyond the personal relationships, the institutional response has been loud too. The Cardinals put out one of the more direct statements among his former teams. They said they were sending strength, love, and support to Chris Johnson, and that they know he'll face this latest challenge with the same tenacity and toughness he's shown in every other one. The Titans owner made a similarly personal statement, one that read less like a corporate press release and more like someone genuinely shaken by the news. She said learning the news was extremely difficult and that they would support Chris every step of the way, holding him and his family close and joining fans everywhere in expressing their love for him across every layer of his life. His wife, his kids, his old teammates, the franchises that once employed him, the same theme keeps showing up. Nobody around Johnson is treating this as a story to move past. They're treating it as an active fight they've all in some way joined. The cameras leave, but Johnson's disease doesn't take a day off, and that's the part of this story people need to sit with. Once the initial shock of the announcement fades, there is no cure for ALS right now. That's not a detail Johnson or his doctors have hidden. No disease-modifying therapy currently halts or reverses ALS, and approved treatments offer only modest survival or functional benefits at best. The numbers on survival are equally blunt. Most patients survive 2 to 5 years following diagnosis, though a small percentage live a decade or longer. That's the range Johnson is living inside right now, at 40, with a disease that's already moved faster in him than his own doctors anticipated. But Johnson hasn't framed his situation as a countdown. He's framed it as leverage, a chance to push research and awareness forward in a way that might change those numbers for someone else, even if it can't change them for him. He's been direct about where his hope actually comes from, and it's not in a miracle reversal of his own case. He said that right now there isn't a cure, but they're seeing more research, more clinical trials, and more promising ideas than ever before. And seeing how hard doctors and researchers are working gives him hope. As long as they're fighting for people with ALS, he's going to keep fighting too. That's the framework he's chosen. Not denial, not despair. A version of fight that accepts the science exactly as it is, and still shows up every day anyway. The doctor overseeing part of his care, Merritt Kudgowich, has spoken about why his case might be responding better than some others. She told GMA she believes his participation in a clinical trial as part of his care may have helped him in his fight, noting he's been on a standard of care involving about 3 different medications that slow the illness, but was also part of a trial for a therapy that decreases inflammation, which she thinks helped him a lot. That's not a cure being described. It's a slowing, a delay, a version of extra time bought through access to research most patients never see. Johnson's public presence hasn't disappeared into the disease either. He's kept a foothold in football through his podcast with former teammate Lendale White, and he'd been eyeing a future in scouting, even attending Senior Bowl programs to learn the craft. He was sharp enough about the game to correctly predict, ahead of hundreds of other pollsters, which receiver the Titans would take in a recent draft. A small, almost playful detail that shows a mind that hasn't slowed down even as his body has. That contrast is really the whole story here. A man whose body could once do things almost no other human body could do is now living inside a body that won't cooperate with the simplest requests. And through a machine that speaks in his own recorded voice, he's told the world without flinching exactly what that gap feels like from the inside. He said he wants people to know he is still him, that ALS has changed what his body can do, but it hasn't changed who he is. He expanded on that thought further, pushing back directly against the instinct people have when they see someone using a wheelchair or a speech device. He said people sometimes look at the physical disability and assume you're not still the same person inside, but he still thinks the same, still dreams, still loves his family. His body just doesn't cooperate. That's the fight, laid out as plainly as it can be. Not a comeback, not a miracle. A man choosing every single day to keep being exactly who he was before any of this started, inside a body that keeps taking pieces of that fight away from him. Brittany is still beside him. His kids are still the reason he wakes up wanting more time. Tim Shaw is still texting him, still pulling strength from him, the same way Johnson pulls it from Shaw's 12 years of experience. And the research he's leaning on, imperfect as it is, keeps moving forward. Because people like him are willing to be the ones who make it personal, publicly, in front of a country that's now watching every single day of this fight alongside him. Sources: ESPN. Former NFL RB. Chris Johnson discusses ALS diagnosis. ABC News. Former NFL star Chris Johnson reveals ALS diagnosis at 39. NFL.com. Former NFL RB. Chris Johnson reveals ALS diagnosis. Tennessee Titans. Former Titans RB. Chris Johnson reveals ALS diagnosis. Neurology Live. Former NFL running back Chris Johnson diagnosed with ALS at 40. CBS Sports. Former NFL running back Chris Johnson reveals ALS diagnosis. Fox News. Chris Johnson's former teammate reflects on ex-star surprise ALS diagnosis. New York Jets. Former Jets RB. Chris Johnson discloses ALS diagnosis. Good Morning America. Former NFL star Chris Johnson reveals ALS diagnosis at 39. Parade. Former NFL RB Chris Johnson reveals ALS diagnosis. Yahoo Sports. NFL world stunned as Chris Johnson reveals ALS diagnosis. A to Z Sports. Chris Johnson's ALS diagnosis announcement hits home for Titans community. https://@osports.com NFL Tennessee Titans news. Chris Johnson, ALS diagnosis announcement. GMA Titans community. Tim